The 75th United Nations General Assembly session begins on Tuesday in a special virtual format due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Before the official start, the General Assembly passed a resolution on tackling the pandemic, calling for intensified international cooperation and solidarity to contain, mitigate, and overcome the pandemic and its consequences. But the U.S. and Israel voted against it. So, how can the UN help promote better international collaboration amid the global challenges posed by COVID-19? And given the World Health Organization's role has been scrutinized during the pandemic, mainly by the United States, how can the organization prove its worth? And what does it all mean to the UN's relevance ahead? Well, joining me to talk more about this from Abuja, Nigeria, via Skype is Mr. Ovigwe Eguegu, a policy advisor at the consulting firm Development Reimagined. And here in Beijing with me is Mr. Einar Tangen, current affairs commentator. And also on the phone, we're joined by Mr. Wang Huiyao, president of the Center for China and Globalization. Thank you so much for joining us to you all. So, the 75th UN General Assembly session just began amid the COVID-19 pandemic, which the UN has called one of the greatest global challenges in the history of the UN. And so far, over 25 million people have been infected with the virus. Over 900,000 have died. We're also seeing an economic fallout in the wake of lockdown measures. And during the pandemic, the UN's role has been challenged, with the U.S. President Donald Trump accusing the WHO, the World Health Organization, of failing to make needed reforms and pulling U.S. funding in May. So let me start with you, Einar. How do you see the UN's role in all of this, specifically the World Health Organization's role, changing over the changing course of the pandemic? What factors account for these divergent opinions?
Well, it's in a nutshell, it's Donald Trump. I mean, you can see that by the vote that was taken. Israel, of course, under pressure to go along with the U.S., but they were the only two no votes out of the entire UN. Absolutely historic, almost historical first. So under these kind of circumstances, you see the U.S. retreating. Donald Trump doesn't like multilateral organizations that have any say over U.S. matters, and he's pulling out his money. In terms of how these entities go forward, unfortunately, it probably needs change. There's a Security Council. There's a lot of feeling that this organization, basically formed after World War II, has kind of become moribund, that it needs to change. And there's going to be some needings, but it's going to take all players at the table to do that, including the U.S. So until a responsible and open U.S. president is elected, it's probable that there's nothing that they can do at this point.
And Mr. Eguegu, let me bring you into this. Should the UN have done more in the early days when it comes to the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the UN was put on the spot, given the whole issue of the coronavirus pandemic, particularly the WHO. But even when you look at the response from the moment it was declared to be a pandemic, I think WHO stepped up his efforts in collaboration with major countries, particularly China, that have provided support to African countries and pretty much countries all over the world. So it's some countries who have pulled away from multilateralism when they should be doubling down on multilateralism at a time the world needs the big players to come together. Just a few countries are stepping up. Some other countries have just decided to just be critical and be skeptical when there is no need for that, and there's more time to collaborate on issues. The WHO really was slow. The UN was on the spot, but I think by the time it was announced, when it became very clear what we are facing, the WHO pretty much stepped up its efforts.
And before the session actually started, the UN General Assembly approved a resolution on tackling the pandemic last Friday. So the 193-member body adopted this resolution by a vote of 169 to 2. Only we have objections from two countries, the United States and Israel. Einar, what grounds did these two countries object? What do the results say about how united the body is?
Well, they rejected it, quite frankly, because Donald Trump doesn't want to admit that there is any problem. If you listen to his campaign rhetoric, we're just about to turn a corner. The world is going to get cooler. there's going to be candy and nuts for Christmas for everybody. I mean, I don't know what to say. As an American, it is heartrending for me to have a president who does not believe that the conditions that we're facing are real. Whether he believes it or not, he's simply telling his base that it doesn't. I mean, you saw that clearly in the two indoor convention, what he called protests, actually his re-election campaign. People uncovered. They've estimated that at each one of those there's going to be a couple hundred deaths, never mind the people who are infected and the people they infect.
So, Mr. Wang, you're joining us on the phone. How do you see the international unity and cooperation on COVID-19 so far? What's been done well and what could have been done much better?
Well, it certainly can be done better. I think that, we have these overwhelming countries that support, I think, the UN. As a matter of fact, I think, the current, the COVID-19 pandemic, crisis, that if all the countries are united and then maybe fighting together, we could have a much better result. Particularly, I think, among the big countries like China and the United States and EU and all the other big players. So it's very unfortunate that we see, the big countries are not really getting along on those issues. If particularly the majority, is talking about 162 countries in favor efforts to combat the COVID-19, and then only 1 or 2 countries are against that. It really tells something, I think, that the multilateral efforts is jeopardized to some extent. So I think we have to build a consensus. I think the UN really that sent a strong message that majority, 90% of the countries wants to fight this together. So how we can really get every country on board, and I think that's a test to our multilateral system and how we can really work together on that.
Right. I want to also pivot to another issue that the UN is focusing on these days. The resolution I mentioned also urges member states to reject racism, xenophobia, hate speech, violence, and discrimination, refrain from promulgating and applying any unilateral economic and financial or trade measures. But in reality, we see trade wars and economic sanctions ongoing, and xenophobia sentiments are still arising in some countries. Some politicians are even fanning hate speeches. Now, since the resolution is not legally binding, Einar, is it just a rubber stamp?
No, it's an expression of hope. They hope that this will be something that causes nation to pause. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. I mean, right now, the world, at 75 years of age, the UN is facing an existential crisis in terms of its own effectiveness and future, because one of its main proponents, the United States, who said we needed a United Nations, is now bailing out. You have 80 million people, an increase by 40 million people over the last decade, who are displaced. The number of people who are going to be food insecure this year is going to be a quarter, who will join, not be malnourished, is 250,000. Those who will be food insecure is going to be 750 million. These are kind of numbers which push social unrest in countries. You're already seeing that disquiet about the health effects and also the economic effects of COVID-19 already on a dampened world economic stage, which is fighting amongst itself. But let us be clear, the fly in the ointment here is Donald Trump and the United States. This is not China saying pull away. China has redoubled its efforts in trying to make the UN work, and it's been accused of somehow infiltrating the WHO because it cooperated with the WHO. If it hadn't cooperated with WHO, they said you're hiding something. So the US is putting China in a no-win position simply to kind of propagate this idea that they want to return to the law of the jungle, the strongest rule, and that is a mistake for the rest of the world.
But with the United States such a strong power now, a lot of people are questioning, you're right, the effectiveness and power of the UN. The reality is the UN has no standing army, no sovereign currency, it has no enforcing agencies. I mean, Mr. Eguegu, what should be done to guarantee that the consensus by countries or this resolution issue can be effectively implemented?
Well, like you rightly pointed out, the UN is not, a government. It's an intergovernmental body. So that means countries have to really, sit together, dialogue, and deliberate on the way, define common objectives and how to move on. But one of the problems we are seeing now is some countries, particularly the United States, has this zero-sum thinking when it comes to international, relations. There needs to be a shift, from that zero-sum thinking to non-zero-sum thinking, so that, collaboratively countries can actually define, and work towards common objectives. The UN has done quite a bit in 75 years, to balance international relations and preserve the world order as we know it. And if you look at the way the world works now, you can have a country as small as, say, Rwanda, with, the United States or China that is many times its size, and that is seen as normal. In a pre-UN world, that is not even thinkable. The big countries just go about, do whatever they like. Well, some of them do. So what we need to see going forward, and like the consultancy I work for, Reimagined, just put that in proposal. There needs to be more accountability, more democratization of the process, for countries to believe, to trust, and the global public to trust and believe in multilateralism, because it really is the only choice we've got. The alternative is terrible, particularly for small and weak countries. In a dog-eat-dog world, it's going to be more chaotic, and more unstable. So I think for us to concentrate on the gains of the United Nations 75 years on, there needs to be a reaffirmation of our commitment to multilateralism, and not just commitment to multilateralism, but also real reform that looks at how the Security Council operates, and that looks at how resolutions are passed, and even when resolutions are passed, mechanism to ensure that people or countries who are signatories are there and rectify these things. But it's very difficult because there is no standing army. But I think if you set resolutions, and like we just seen with the recent 169-2 rule, I mean, that's very, very clear. It shows that the world sees a direction that it wants to move towards. 2 countries, that's not even the issue. The focus has to be on the 169 countries and what they have decided to stand for. And what they have decided to stand for is to work together collaboratively to move in the direction that is mutual and equally beneficial for all countries in mitigating the economic impact of COVID-19, and also making the world safe and preparing for the next, because this is just one pandemic. What happens after this? The economic recovery is still an ongoing process, and that is why for it is very important that emphasis is laid on cooperation and solidarity.
This is a platform where countries exercise multilateralism, and China has long been a main supporter of multilateralism. In this paper on the 75th anniversary of the UN released last week, China calls on countries to safeguard the principles of the UN Charter, defend the UN-centered international system and the international order underpinned by international law. And Mr. Wang, let me get your take on this. How do you look at China's role in the global response to the challenge posed by COVID-19, especially in terms of working with the WHO in the early days?
Well, I think that China is certainly doing its best, and is also getting to play more active role in the international multilateral system such as UN. UN has been there for the last 75 years and really safeguarded the world, and we haven't got any third world war broke out. I mean, except now we have this third world war by the virus attack. So it's so important that we work together. I think China now is contributing the second largest donor to the United Nations, the largest peace-sending country of the Security Council members, but also China is actively supporting WHO President Xi's pledging $2 billion US in terms of fighting COVID-19. So I think that China is certainly doing its best, and China has a lot of things to work with other countries. And I think that the UN and also WHO can work with China and all the other countries together, that we form a global health consensus to really fight this, and share the vaccine, share the practices, share the scientific way of how to combat COVID-19. So I think that China certainly has an active role to play. The key is now we can get really all the countries at the UN flag and the UN coordination, and we really should make that more stronger than before.
Yeah, it seems the multilateral world order that UN has been advocating is now under threat, but we'll see how this multi-mighty organization will respond to that. Many thanks to my guest, Mr. Ovigwe Eguegu, a policy advisor at the consulting firm Development Reimagined, Mr. Wang Huiyao, president of the Center for China and Globalization, and Einar Tangen, current affairs commentator. We'll take a short break here on The Point, and when we return, is a potential TikTok Oracle tech partnership music to Trump's ears or out of tune with reality? What is the latest in the TikTok Trump saga? Stay with us.